The title of this exhibit is Freedom and Justice, Cecil Williams Captures Columbia's Civil Rights Movement. What makes this exhibit unique is that it tells the forgotten story of Columbia's civil rights struggle between the years 1955 and 1965. Cecil Williams himself forgot that he had taken many of these images of civil rights activities in South Carolina's capital city. Many of his more well-known works, such as Freedom and Justice, Out of the Box in Dixie, and Orangeburg 1968, highlight the civil rights struggle in Orangeburg, South Carolina, and surrounding counties. So this has been a really unique opportunity to tell Columbia's story in a way that has not been done before. Among the things that we'll discuss today are the sit-in protests, which took place in downtown on Main Street, which were conducted by students from Allen University and Benedict College between the years 1960 and 1962. We also will highlight aspects of the South Carolina State NAACP conference and their effort to fight Jim Crow laws in the courts. And most importantly, we also will discuss Mr. Williams' relationship with many of these prominent civil rights figures, individuals such as Matthew Perry, the famed civil rights attorney from Columbia, South Carolina. Also, Majeska Simpkins is highlighted in this exhibit, a very fierce advocate of civil rights and human dignity from Columbia, South Carolina as well. So we're really going to touch on a number of hidden stories, stories that are not well known to the American public, but are being told for the first time in a very unique way in this particular exhibit. One of the unique additions to Freedom and Justice, the exhibit that we've done here at the Richland Library using Mr. Williams' photographs, we have a very unique addition to this, and it is moving footage from MERC, the Moving Image Research Collections at the University of South Carolina. Now, they've partnered with us on a number of ventures, but this exhibit at Richland Library has been really unique because the moving images taken from the local WIS television collection have been paired with photography done by famed civil rights photographer Cecil Williams. The value of this moving footage is that it provides a very different perspective on student activism and also the sit-in protests that took place in downtown Columbia on Main Street. While Cecil was able to capture still images of various civil rights activists, the moving images, well, you see them in action, marching on the State House on March 2nd, 1961, participating in downtown sit-in protests throughout the years 1960 to 1962, and really taking the fight to the powers that were in charge during the early 1960s here in the city of Columbia. Mr. Williams will be joining us shortly to tell us a little bit about his own background and his experience taking these various images that we have on display here. Before we get to that, I want to also thank our partners with the Columbia SC63 initiative, the City of Columbia, the Historic Columbia Foundation, the Columbia Visitors Bureau, and the University of South Carolina. You'll also see images from the University of South Carolina's Moving Image Research Collection, which really provide a different perspective on these particular photographs that we'll be discussing today. And so we'll get to that shortly as well. But thank you once again to the Richland Library for collaborating with us on this effort, and we will have Mr. Williams with us shortly.
Someone had to do it. And I am so very proud of the fact that seemingly my destiny was to record South Carolina's civil rights movement and all of the people that paid such great sacrifices to make these changes against Jim Crow and racism. I started in photography at 9 years old with a hand-me-down camera that you see here, which is called the Baby Brownie. It was a one-button camera using 127 film. And after taking photographs, I remember having to carry my film to a drugstore and developing them. Of course, the first events I shot at 9 years old were not civil rights events, but more or less family photographs that I took. And a lot of times I used my Baby Brownie here to make money. I would go down to Edisto Gardens on Sunday and take pictures of families and earn $1 per picture. So imagine, you might say, in the mind of a child 9 years old, and that far back, that was probably $1 was probably maybe $25 maybe today. But my second camera was a camera that had a flash unit. And at 11 years old, I acquired this camera, which I also photographed Thurgood Marshall getting off a train in Charleston, South Carolina. So this and so many other events encouraged me to really engage myself in photography, and also to let this really turn out to be my profession. There were so many events that happened and so many circumstances that really kind of just mold me into being a photographer. And I'm, again, so very happy that someone had to do it, and I think I was that person. At 14 years old, I became a correspondent for Jet Magazine. Jet Magazine and its correspondents came into Orangeburg, and there was an ongoing civil rights event, and they wanted it covered, and so they assigned me to cover it. And so from that moment on, I worked for Jet Magazine. And that was very encouraging because, for example, as a high school student, and I had a press card, being that I was a recognized press person working for the a national publication like Jet was. In 1961, I believe it was, I had the occasion to be asked by Jet Magazine to go to Clemson University at that moment when Harvey Gantt becomes the first person of his race, of our race, to go to Clemson. And the press card that you see here is the press card that was issued upon appearing at Clemson, and which I wore on my lapel, which was required at the time. Clemson integrated with dignity. There were no incidents. Everything was peaceful. SLED had ensured that this would be a peaceful incident. Looking back on those days, I remember being one of the 250 correspondents who covered that event on that day. And again, it was one of those events that really it's an unforgettable event even today. As I talk about those days and those times, I remember things keep coming back to me, which were reminiscent of that particular day on Clemson when Harvey Gantt became the first of our race to really enter Clemson University. One way to move along the efforts to bring better jobs, to get rid of Jim Crow, to fight racism and discrimination was the protests and boycott. And so African Americans at this time in Columbia, Orangeburg, Sumter, Rock Hill, Greenville, and other places, and Charleston, by the way, used the method of boycott. And one of the methods was to, of course, make pickets signs and actually engaged in encouraging people to not shop at stores that discriminated against African Americans, that stores that would not provide opportunities or employment for African Americans. For example, the dime stores you would be able to shop in if you were an African American, but you were not allowed to sit down. And to bring about this change and to bring about the awareness of this fact that this was what was happening, the signs and pickets that you see in this exhibit, really, they were very fruitful in making that change. The other thing that's often overlooked is the fact that mostly youth were involved in these efforts. They were the ones that walked the picket lines and demonstrated and marched. Unfortunately, a lot of South Carolina's history hasn't made the history books. Hopefully this exhibit by the Richland County Public Library and your efforts at the University of South Carolina and the City of Columbia and the 1963 project will bring some change to this so that South Carolina will receive its worthwhile place in history as being at the forefront of the efforts to bring down and bring an end to racism and Jim Crow laws. I think that South Carolina law enforcement officials, maybe the general public, and of course organizations like the NAACP, a lot of credit should be given to the fact that they kept the South Carolina movements mainly and roughly, and I would say for the most part, peaceful. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, the dignity under which Harvey Gantt enters Clemson and other demonstrations were mostly peaceful demonstrations, and not much violence came upon citizens participating in these events. However, an exception to that was the incident involving Lenny Moore. I think Lenny Moore was a student at Benedict College, and he could be seen almost every day after his classes carrying a sign on Main Street in Columbia, asking people not to shop, and comparing South Carolina with Mississippi, and the fact that, thank God for Mississippi, that South Carolina is not on the bottom of the list. South Carolina, Georgia, and Mississippi often seemingly in the minds of us in the movement as being trying to compete to see who was treating African Americans the worst, under what laws that were used to keep African Americans from achieving their first-class citizenship. And so Lenny Moore, upon being on the forefront, was stabbed by a passerby. I'm not sure whether the person was ever caught or whether they were ever apprehended or any notice came upon it. But that did not stop him. Later, after recovering from a stab wound, he returned to the streets of Columbia to march and demonstrate, as we see on this picture here. I was very proud of taking these pictures because, again, they ended up in Jet Magazine's This Week's Best Pictures. And I hope that maybe I have an opportunity as days go by. I believe Mr. Moore is still living. I'm sorry, Lenny Glover. I'm sorry, yes. Again, we're talking about events that are 50 and 60 years old, and sometimes the mind doesn't really recall, but Lenny Moore, Lenny Glover, yes, is the gentleman in these photographs. One thing that is pretty obvious from the photographs, you would notice that the students in these photographs are well dressed. So that was something that I think all could be proud of, the fact that these were young men and young women who wanted to put their foot forward. They would put on their Sunday best and go out and engage in demonstrations. Oftentimes, if they were arrested, they would go to jail very well dressed. And that was something that I think was unique to the movement, not only in South Carolina, but other states as well, where there were demonstrations going on. So many of the important beginnings of the marches and demonstrations, the students gathered at churches in Orangeburg and in Columbia and Sumter and everywhere else. So the church played a very important role. It was a safe haven. It was a lot of times after a march, the gathering point of students getting out of jail. So students started there, and a lot of times they ended there. This was a very wonderful event to be a part of. I remember it being a beautiful Sunday afternoon, and I was called to Zion to take pictures, again, I think by Reverend Newman and others alerted me to the fact that there would be this celebration of the success of the Edwards versus South Carolina event. And I remembered, again, arriving, and at this time in my life, I'm using a twin lens camera. I believe I was using a Rolleiflex camera, which was a very popular type of camera at that time. But I also, at this time, had learned in photographing for Jet to carry two cameras. So for Jet Magazine, I also had over my shoulders and around my neck another camera, a 35 millimeter camera. The image you see in front of me, again, of this is Judge Matthew Perry. people seated in the pews. This is J. Arthur Brown, another often forgotten about hero of South Carolina's civil rights movement, a person that really was at a time the president of the South Carolina NAACP. This is a overview, and the lights you see in the back of this picture have been placed there by, I believe, WIS-TV for this event. This is, of course, a picture of one of the front rows of showing mostly students who are engaged in a march where they actually marched around the church. And this one as well. As you will also notice, the students are carrying a picture of President John F. Kennedy. Again, a very popular figure at the time, who at this time I think was the President of the United States, if I'm correct chronologically. Yes. Okay. This is a photograph taken by my very trustworthy friend, longtime friend, Benny Brown, who also photographed the Columbia Civil Rights Movement. Benny was a close friend then and now today. I taught Benny photography when he came to Claflin University as a student, and oftentimes he would photograph me in various incidents, involving incidents, and I would photograph him. This is at a governor's inauguration. I think it's right off of Main Street here in Columbia, and we have Judge Matthew Perry. We have a minister from Orangeburg, and then of course myself in the photograph as well. This particular photograph here, if we could sort of move along, is a photograph of two persons from Orangeburg who have come out of the administration building at the University of South Carolina, where they were unable to get the papers necessary to register to go to the University of South Carolina. Their names right now I can't remember, but again, it was a situation that I photographed where they informed me that they were going to do this and asked me if I wanted to photograph them, which I did.
Now these two photographs were taken in April of 1960. The individual on the left is Raymond Weston. The individual on the right is Lloyd Williams.
Yes.
And so tell us a little bit more about this experience, though. You get the phone call, and then you go down to take these photos. What happened during this moment? Walk us through it.
Well, a lot of times there was some element of danger or some element of concern by photographers during this period. Fortunately, I only went to jail twice and then bailed out of jail in about an hour. So I was never attacked or received any injuries in my efforts. However, in photographing this event at the administration building, I had to, when we were inside the building, when they were trying to get the registration papers, I did have to hide my camera under my coat and remain as unnoticeable as I could, because a lot of times police authorities, a lot of times, again, officers like this really did not want to be photographed showing what was at that time, I would say, a part of South Carolina that I'm sure they did not want to really be seen across the nation. Segregation, again, I think really it was something that had remained in the state of South Carolina as other southern states, and many times when I photographed signs and symbols of segregation, as I did with photographing a colored restroom sign in Orangeburg, South Carolina, the officials were not comfortable with that. In fact, I was run out of a courthouse for trying to do that very thing. The photograph you see here was taken of Henri Monteith, and this was an assignment I did for Jet Magazine. Again, another time that I made the best pictures of the week. There's another photograph of Henri where she's actually reading the letter where she has been accepted and becomes the first African-American since Reconstruction that was admitted to the University of South Carolina. Again, this was on an assignment for Jet Magazine. This is just one of the hundreds of photographs I have of Matthew Perry, again, a pivotal figure in the civil rights movement. Here's a photograph that's taken, I believe, on either Allen University or Benedict University campus, where I think it's closer to 1964-65, because then, although some gains had been made in the civil rights movement, voting was then the next target. We'd brought down some of the lunch counters at this time. There were other opportunities opening up for African Americans, but again, the voting rights was a particular effort that we needed to engage in to bring about fairness in voting, and also to get rid of the discriminatory laws that affected African Americans relative to voting. So here they are on the campus of either Benedict or Allen, where they are being directed by Reverend Newman. And as you see, they are pinning signs which they marched around, and again, getting people to be aware of the Voting Rights Act. Again, I have here a photograph of a person who should have received more credit relative to civil rights in America. But again, the fact that so much of South Carolina's history has really been hidden and today does not appear in a lot of history books. This is Majeska Simpkins, who was really, again, a pivotal person in her role here in South Carolina, being associated with the NAACP and doing so much to bring about change in this state. Here's a photograph that was taken of her probably when she was about 75 or 80 years old. It was taken in the church, and she has a cane over here that aided her in walking. I believe I photographed her at an event of a celebration at, I believe this is Benedict College. This is a contemporary photograph, relatively contemporary. This is a march here in Columbia, South Carolina, where students and individuals from around the state have gathered in a march, again, to protest against the flag flying on the state capitol. And as you see, there are many placards and signs, and as students and people are marching in the streets, as it is with also in this photograph here, the young man holding up the sign. One of the things I have enjoyed about photography is that it provided an excellent opportunity for me to be really very close into the civil rights movement, and very close into events, and be among the decision makers and the people that are actually planning the marches, and the people that are actually gathering the strategy and planning the strategy. So it was my great unforgettable pleasure to really be in the midst of people like Thurgood Marshall, I.D. Quincy Newman, and in this particular instance, I have here photographs of the gentleman that did so much for civil rights in South Carolina. He was a person that was able to get thousands of students out of jail. Matthew Perry played a very important role in South Carolina civil rights history. He should be a person that every school child should know about. He should be in every history book. Unfortunately, a lot of the events that we have seen today, a lot of the events and photographs that the Richland County Public Library has put on display here haven't been seen by the general public, and won't make themselves, they won't be appearing in a lot of history books. They should. Perhaps that will change. But it was quite a journey as a photographer, as a photojournalist, to really cover the civil rights movement. I'd like to also mention that police authorities often did not see any difference between me as a photographer and me being a demonstrator or a person marching or protesting. oftentimes, in fact, police authorities would try and get me away from what was going on in the first place. If I were not arrested, again, really they would make it difficult for me to photograph an event. They knew that in reality, the pen is mightier than the sword, and these events being photographed and news articles written about them would be a powerful element to bring down the doors of discrimination and racism. Because of the shirt that I have on, I believe this to be associated with my going down to the coast to really, at the request of I. DeQuincy Newman, to take pictures of what was then called a wade-in. Here we have not only stores and theaters and restaurants, being places that African Americans were not able to enjoy or shop, but we have actually the Atlantic Ocean that we can't even go to a beach. And so Reverend Newman called me to photograph that event. And on the way back, I believe this photograph was taken by a friend of mine by the name of Rendell Harper. But we had stopped some store someplace, and there it was after hours for that store, and there seemed to be no one around. So this was sort of a prank photograph that I took, and I sneaked a drink of water from a white-only water fountain. And I thought it very iconic that, again, that doing this exhibit, that this photograph was placed right by a water fountain of today. And I thought this would be very interesting and a very innovative way of telling a story and contrasting that. The picture of Thurgood Marshall behind me is one of my favorite photographs. It, in many ways, historically speaking and chronologically speaking, helps me, and it should help historians to really connect the dots with history. For example, so much of South Carolina's history, as I may have said earlier, has been left out of the history books. But here's a photograph of Thurgood Marshall, who has returned right after his achievement of the Brown versus Board of Education decision by the Supreme Court. This was, of course, May 16th, 1954. And this picture, I believe, is about October or November of that same year. And Thurgood Marshall has returned to really Clarendon County, South Carolina, Columbia, South Carolina, and Orangeburg. This picture was taken on the Claflin University campus where he gave an address. And it's important about this picture is that from this event attended by hundreds of Orangeburg citizens, 10 Orangeburg citizens chose to test the ruling of the Supreme Court. And they signed their names asking the Orangeburg School District 5 to admit their children to the public schools. Hence, this became one of the first test cases. And these particular test cases, really the persons who engaged in them were subject to boycotts themselves, intimidation tactics. Their loans were called from banks, sometimes house foreclosures. All kinds of terrible things began to happen to them for their efforts. As a result, to counter these efforts by the Citizens Council of Orangeburg, the people of Orangeburg engaged in a boycott. And this boycott, again, its importance in history, it was used as a template for the events developing later at the Montgomery bus boycott, when they chose to, again, after Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King came in to the efforts, that particular method of protesting against the Montgomery bus transportation system was adopted by, again, the Montgomery bus boycott to counter and to bring down discrimination so far as public seating on buses in Montgomery, Alabama.
All right. Well, thank you for walking us through the exhibit and sharing some of your insights. I wanted to finish with this photograph, which in many ways I think is one of your more iconic photos. Tell us a little bit about this piece and what it means to you.
I took this photograph sometimes in the 1960s. I really wish I had put a date on the negatives and so forth, but I thought it to be a very interesting image, and I've never known who the young man is, unfortunately. I think that if he were to come to me today to demand some royalties for this picture, I would have to pay them because I have used it many times, but I think that it definitely was a march on the state capitol. It was definitely probably between 1960 and 1963, and I remember that he's looking up like that because I think they were singing "We Shall Overcome" as the protest song of those days, and it appears that he's been held by an adult, which I think to be his mother, and surrounded by other individuals, and he caught my attention as being a very great subject to take a picture of, because again, seemingly the adults towered over him, and just a sliver of light kind of entered down and lit his face, and I kind of kneeled down and photographed this event. It's been probably my most requested picture. It has probably found itself into hundreds of publications, hundreds of program covers. It's been in the front cover of my book, Freedom and Justice, and it's one of my favorite photographs. The photograph on the behind you on the right also, again, is a photograph taken at the state capitol. Of course, it's at a time when there's no demonstration, but I think that on other copies of this photograph, the rest of the dome is shown, but I think at this time, which I believe to be about 1958 or 59, there are no flags flying on the state capitol. I think the flags went up at a later time. Of course, it could have been that it was taken on a day that maybe this particular day they didn't have any flags up. But anyway, this is a pose picture that I made. A lot of my pictures, and my favorite technique would be pictures that are unposed, where the person's actually themselves engaged in some type of activity or action. But this is a case where I wanted to illustrate something, and so I posed the tiny figure of a young man looking up at the state capitol. And in a way, given the time and date, a youth wondering whether or not his fate would be like that of his grandparents and parents who had endured Jim Crow and segregation, and whether his life would also be left to those consequences. So again, I like this photograph very much. I believe it was taken with a twin lens reflex camera that I used at the time. And again, I believe it to be a photograph that I did on a Saturday morning, given the lighting and other things that appear on the photograph.
Once again, we'd like to thank Mr. Cecil Williams for sharing his fantastic series of photos highlighting civil rights here in Columbia. We would also like to thank the Richland Library for partnering with us in this effort. And once again, we'd like to fill you in on a little bit more information about the Columbia SC63 project. Our website is www.columbiasc63.com. And Mr. Williams' point about this young man not knowing who he is a salient one. One of the reasons we've been able to accomplish what we have throughout the last year and a half is the really dedicated effort of professionals in the field of history, but also the community support that we've received. Once again, we invite you to share your story, to help us identify some of the photographs that we have. We have a series of public events that will be coming up throughout the remainder of this year and into early next year. So please continue to visit the website for more information about these. But without your help, we'll never be able to fully tell this powerful narrative of civil rights here in the city. And so once again, thank you so much for joining us today.